Looks like we've got a few people, but people are still jumping in online here. I don't know if we want to give it just another minute, and then Eric, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, you want me to wait another minute?
It looks like we have 13 people online, so if you want to give people another minute, that's up to you.
Okay, can do.
Looks like we're up to 15 now. Yeah, Eric, just whenever you're ready.
Okay, let's get started. I see a few familiar folks there in the list, so welcome everybody. My name is Eric Kingston. I'm the Housing Resources Coordinator for Idaho Housing and Finance Association and on the board of the Idaho Rural Partnership. I am really happy to have a group of people here that know a lot about the analysis of impediments process, which is something you're going to learn about today if you haven't already figured that out. And let me just kind of get started on our screen share, make sure I've got everything set the way it needs to go. And if you can confirm that you're seeing the right screen, you guys. Everything good? All right, fantastic. So yeah, welcome to this session. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the entitlement communities that have been undergoing an analysis of impediments process, and also the statewide analysis process, which is happens every 5 years, and we're engaged in the 2021 AI process at this point. So I'm going to talk through a little bit of that. So our guests today, our presenters, we're going to be Heidi Aguilar from Root Policy Research, formerly with BBC Research and Consulting out of Denver. She's worked on numerous AIs and other projects in the state of Idaho. Elizabeth McNanny, who is with Resource Consultants, and Elizabeth is kind of spearheading the AI process for several entitlement communities in Idaho. And finally, we're going to hear from Tony Tenney with Idaho Commerce. Commerce and IHFA both participate. We partner with this AI process and have done over the last 20 or so years that I've been involved with it. So we're just kind of gearing up for the next one. So here's a little outline of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about fair housing choice and access in general terms. I'm going to introduce some of those concepts, why it matters to different audiences. Heidi's going to go through the statewide AI process and what they've found to date. We're still in the kind of preliminary stages. And then Elizabeth is going to give us some information about her experience with entitlement communities and what's going on with them. Tony's going to talk about commerce and the non-entitlement sections of the state. It's kind of what IHFA deals with as well. We're hoping to leave time for some discussion, have questions from you all, and maybe share some of the things that are going on in your communities, and find out like what you need to do to learn more about this process. And then we've got some resources at the end of this that you can take a look at. So first of all, I think Jesse's going to share a couple polls so we know kind of who's participating and what you all know at this point.
So we have 2 polls, it looks like. The first one is how familiar are you with federal affirmatively further housing, AFFH requirements? And let's see some results here. It looks like we have people who are not very familiar for the most part, and then somewhat familiar and very familiar. a little lower there. So it looks like we're going to learn some stuff here today. And then the other is, what aspects of fair housing do you wish you knew more about? Looks like the intersection between local zone and fair housing is one that a lot of people are interested in. And then we got some relevant case decisions, fair housing violations in Idaho, and what makes a community vulnerable to fair housing challenges. Turn it back over to
Okay,
you.
I see Heidi taking some notes there. I knew she would. Okay, that's great. That helps us a lot. I think we're going to be able to touch on some of those issues for you in the presentation. Then we can elaborate and kind of dive a little deeper with those. Okay. So I will share my screen again. All right, everything coming through okay? You all can, see the Taj Mahal there. No, I'm just kidding. Question marks. All right, let's see. Okay, we're going to watch a quick video. It's under a minute, and this is part of a project that IHFA undertook. We received funding from HUD to do some fair housing education and outreach this year, and we've created a few little videos that are good resources for you guys and your constituents.
What does fair housing mean to you? The Fair Housing Act guarantees everyone the right to live where we choose and can afford. It's called housing choice. The law prohibits discrimination in any housing-related activity based on protected class, meaning our race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, or national origin. Housing choice affects our access to employment, education, healthcare, transportation, clean air and water, and healthy food.
Whoop. Sorry about that.
What does each of us has a chance to succeed? We all win. To learn more, call 211 or visit idahohousing.com/fair housing.
Okay, apologies for the technical glitch. Apparently, I can't mute myself while the video is playing, so now I know. I'll let that be a lesson to everybody. Okay, so let's talk about why this matters to you guys, you planners out there. First of all, the APA has a lot of really detailed positions on this topic, and I was just kind of looking at their website recently and pulled a couple of these quotes off of there. So they've got a podcast that has some really good information about kind of structural racism that has been perpetuated over decades in planning. Unfortunately, it's been codified in a lot of policies throughout the country. And so I think the APA in general is trying to address some of those issues. And so I would encourage you to take a look at some of these. These are, when you get this presentation later, these are linked to the articles you can find. And then here's a nice quote that just basically says we need to work really hard to address, some of these inequities and in some cases things that we've kind of built into our system, we need to unbuild. So why it matters to individuals, where we live basically determines our access to all the community assets that make life, productive and interesting and safe, and things like employment and law enforcement and recreation, educational opportunities, things like that. And then equal access to things like home ownership help us promote generational wealth transfer. So it's basically the main way families can pass wealth on to their children and grandchildren. And a lot of folks, unfortunately, through redlining and other practices, have been kind of locked out of that process. And so there's a big wealth gap in this country, and it's actually pretty extreme. Let's see. Move on to the next. Why it matters to local and state government. In the past AIs, one of the things that we've looked at is looked at fair housing through an economic opportunity lens, and how access to housing and having housing choice essentially creates more productivity. Students are more productive in schools, workers are more productive on the job. Again, they have more stability, and that translates into being able to be engaged in the community, productive contributors to community and the economy. So it provides economic opportunity, and that in turn is linked to the long-term economic gains of cities and states. So it's important also for local governments to understand trends in case law. I noticed that was one of the items that people are interested in learning more about. I think Heidi and Elizabeth will be able to tell you more about that too. Basically, I've got three different cases that might be of interest to folks, and we can create some links to these cases as well. A lot of people might be familiar with the Boise County case. It was over a decade ago, I think, where the county commissioners denied a permit to, I think it was a residential treatment facility, and they were subsequently sued under the Fair Housing Act, and I believe the county had to pay in upwards of $5 million for that. So it's a pretty costly thing. Westchester is not technically a fair housing case. It was a case brought under the False Claims Act, also resulted in a huge settlement and demand that the Westchester County had to build lots of housing for folks that had been shut out. Traficante is an old fair housing case brought by two white tenants that claimed that the housing provider had a pattern of practice of discriminating against people of color and denied them the opportunity to live in a diverse community. And so that was, I think, the first fair housing case that went to the Supreme Court. Heidi can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But so anyway, know about developers in NIMBY. There are also some cases Heidi shared with me links to some cases involving developers that had actually sued after their affordable housing complexes were denied a permit, claiming a fair housing violation. So that's worth exploring, I think, for everybody. And then just to illustrate this a little bit, on the left, these are Swiss cranes. I don't know if you can really recognize them that way, but this is a shot from a trip I made to Switzerland a while ago to visit some friends. And my friend Willie and I were walking to the farmer's market one day and passed this big construction site. And I asked him what it was. He said, "Oh, it's a new social housing development," which is their term for affordable housing. And he said, "My pension fund, we all decided we would invest in this project." And he said, "We knew we might get a higher rate of return on something else, but if we create this social housing in our neighborhood, our taxes will be lower going forward." So they kind of connected the dots and understood that stability and the economic opportunity provided by housing stability would create a more productive group of tenants who would be contributing to the tax base rather than depending on it. And again, liability, I just mentioned some of those cases that we can talk about in more detail later on. So what's an AI? It's required of any jurisdiction that administers funds from HUD. It is basically a way to analyze, demographics, look at complaint data, look at your land use pattern and practice, evaluate policies that might either contribute to, create barriers or remove barriers. There's a lot of surveys of stakeholders and, focus groups. Some of you may have been involved in some of those for the statewide AI or the entitlement communities. And then looks at all the potential barriers to fair housing choice, and then looks at actions to take to address those. And also we use it to help inform some of our resource allocation. And again, just an illustration of some of the community work that goes on, the kinds of stakeholder interviews and processes that allow people to contribute to that overall understanding. There's also lots of data analysis, like I mentioned. This is just a screenshot from a really cool data dashboard that Root Policy put together for the statewide AI. This is actually a hot link to that data dashboard. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. I find it really useful for some of my projects. And then I'm going to turn things over to Heidi and she's going to talk a little bit more about this.
Thank you so much, Eric, and welcome everybody. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm from a women-owned consulting firm called Root Policy. We're in Colorado, and we do work pretty much all throughout the country for fair housing, as well as needs assessments. And we've done for a number of years both market studies, needs assessments, helped with the state's consolidated plan, and done some fair housing work in the state. And we've also worked in many local governments too, units of local government in Idaho, although most of that work was done under our former firm called BBC. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of the affirmatively furthering fair housing concept, which is what AFFH stands for. And when we got really deep into this work in 2014 to 2017 when the Obama administration rolled out this concept of sustainable communities, which were planning grants, helping communities think a little more, I would say, precisely about inequities. And so we started working on some of those. That evolved into what became, for a little bit of time, something called the Assessment of Fair Housing. And under that framework, we were doing training throughout the country and working closely with HUD's National Fair Housing and Equity and Opportunity Office, and so delivered a lot of the training and really understood where there were tensions and challenges with local jurisdictions primarily in trying to do this work. So I think about this a lot from that perspective, so kind of like from your perspective as well, and what this means to you, and hopefully I'll talk I'll sort of meet you where you are today, but then certainly answer some questions as we go throughout the presentation. So Eric talked a little bit about like the logical reasons of why one would want to address fair housing barriers, because there's economic payoff, there's an economic interest on behalf of local governments to do that. I'm going to start with a little more of the mundane and talk about what you have to do and why. So there's a lot of confusion with the acronyms in this world because they all start with A and they all mean something different. And the first one is sort of the big picture, affirmatively furthering fair housing. That AFFH is an obligation that's in the Fair Housing Act way back to 1968. There is a provision that says, it basically says that the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing is not only HUD's obligation, but everybody who HUD works with must try and reduce barriers to housing choice. At that time, there was a real strong focus on segregation and division racially among America's communities. And the brain behind that, for a very short period of time, was Mitt Romney's dad, George Romney. So he was the HUD secretary under the Nixon administration when this all was rolling out. And he had this vision, which he called open communities, and tried to enact that by refusing to give local jurisdictions money, block grant money, if they didn't comply with this affirmatively furthering fair housing vision. That didn't go real far forward under the Nixon administration, but that's a lot of that is interesting because it's sort of the conversation that we're having today. And I think one can think back to 1968 or that time period and wonder if we had been a little more open at that point in time, if the world would look different, if we wouldn't be dealing with some of the challenges that we've got today in terms of inequity. Go ahead and go forward, Eric. So one thing that I think where there's a lot of confusion, particularly within like planning commissions and city councils, and I should say I sat on Denver's planning board for a number of years, particularly when these concepts of equity were starting to really become front and center in some of the decision making. And so I had I feel like a unique perspective in how people were struggling with decisions and bringing the equity into that decision making. And one of the things, at least in my part of the world here, that's been confusing to local jurisdictions is the difference between Fair Housing Act obligation and the AFFH obligation. So the Fair Housing Act basically says a developer, anybody who's providing housing, a unit of local government cannot deny housing. So it focuses on a barrier. And the operative word there is deny or make unavailable. Even if you're not receiving money from IHFA or from Idaho Commerce as a jurisdiction, or even if you're not getting it directly from HUD, if you're an entitlement jurisdiction, you still can't violate the Fair Housing Act. That is a different act. AFFH is embedded in that act. So AFFH applies to you if you receive any money from HUD. It's a little bit quirky when we start thinking about low-income housing tax credits and whether or not the IRS falls under that obligation. That hasn't been articulated, I would say, as much as this obligation being embedded in HUD. So even though it feels like it should be, it's just not as front and center. Go ahead and go forward. So in terms of kind of bigger picture, so moving beyond the mundane requirement, Eric talked a little bit about this, but I just want to reiterate a couple of things because I think it's really, really important to help your leaders understand this. So there's sort of the moral obligation of affirmatively furthering fair housing, and that's where George Romney landed, was that, we have a moral obligation to reduce the harms that we have caused certain people in America. And affirmatively furthering fair housing is one of those ways that we can do that. Kind of beyond that, so let's say that really doesn't, tug at the heartstrings of your planning commissioners or city councilors. Numerous studies, and this is even studies that have been done over the last couple of years, particularly under COVID, have shown that housing stability leads to positive economic returns. And the person who gets the most credit for that is Raj Chetty. He's done a lot of work around economic opportunity and what that means for children, particularly when they move into highly resourced neighborhoods. There's a couple of other studies that have shown, similar findings. And one was done by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it found that households who are living in public housing, even if it's in a low opportunity or low resource neighborhood, they still do better over time. So housing stability is really a very, very significant factor in economic opportunity, in building self-sufficiency and sustainability among households. The problem is that those returns are not immediately realized. So what we know is if we move children into highly resourced neighborhoods, for the most part, when they're young, they do better off, regardless of who those kids are, where they're moving to. So where in America they've made that move. When they become adults, they're less likely to commit crime. They have higher earnings. For girls, they're less likely to get pregnant when they're teenagers. So those returns in terms of the public sector, those are enormous over time when you add them all up. They work a little differently when we move kids when they're older. So kids don't always integrate as well into different communities when they age. But the problem is, if I'm planning commissioner, I'm on city council, I don't see that immediate return. When I'm making a decision about a development today, it's hard for me to say, just the reality is that 25 years from now, these kids will be doing better, or the community will do better as a result. And so that's, I think where the real tension is with this, is that the decision I'm making today doesn't necessarily have an immediate return or immediate economic return. My incentive is typically to appease the people who are coming to that meeting, and generally the people who show up are the people who are opposed to affordable housing or any kind of development. So thinking longer term, or challenging your local officials to think longer term, I think will be better for everybody in the long run. But the problem is it's a longer term payoff. Go ahead and go forward. So a bit about kind of, back to the obligation and what you're supposed to be doing and how this evolved, because it's really confusing, I think, right now. So I talked about AFFH being part of the Fair Housing Act. I talked about George Romney really attempting to enforce the core spirit of AFFH. Not a lot happened for many years, for almost 25 years. And then HUD created, Eric talked about the analysis of impediments, so another acronym. In the mid-90s, HUD rolled out a guidebook, you can Google it, the Fair Housing Planning Guide, that said, to certify that you are affirmatively furthering fair housing, people who are receiving HUD block grants, why don't you think about doing this kind of a study? And we'll call it an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. And this is a framework for how to do it. And there's some best practices here. And I would argue that it's still a pretty good document. We refer to it a lot when we're looking at particularly statewide studies. I think it gives a good guidance for states. It actually tackles some areas that the future iterations of the AI didn't really tackle. So for those of you, and you still have an option to do an AI, that are doing an AI, I think the Fair Housing Planning Guide is still pretty relevant. Things got a little tricky in 2010 when a government accounting office audit found that HUD was not consistently or effectively enforcing AIs, and that triggered an examination of how the federal government could do this better, as many GAO audits do. Go ahead and go forward. And then after that, in 2015, and this was somewhat correlated or associated with a Supreme Court decision that found disparate impact is part of the Fair Housing Act. So that was a case that was brought by the Inclusive Communities Project against the Texas equivalent of IHFA. It really centered around low-income housing tax credit and decisions that were made about where LIHTC developments were placed within the state of Texas. Sort of long story short, the Supreme Court only considered one question, and they threw back all of the other decisions to district court in the state of Texas. And that one question was, does the Fair Housing Act have what's called disparate impact? Meaning that, is it just looking at direct discrimination, or could I make a decision, and I'm not, that doesn't really, my intention is not to discriminate, but has the effect of discriminating against protected classes? Could I be liable under the Fair Housing Act? And the short answer is yes. So all this is going on around 2015, and HUD rolls out a new rule called the Assessment of Fair Housing that's a little more of a holistic view. So it doesn't look at direct discrimination. It goes beyond, broadens the concepts that were articulated in that Fair Housing Guide. And it says, and it brings in like some of the spirit of Raj Chetty's research, which is, we know that communities are better off if people aren't living in segregated poverty. That doesn't do anybody any good. And so let's think more holistically about transportation and education and job opportunities and integration of communities to try and alleviate the costs of poverty. And that was really the spirit of the Assessment of Fair Housing. So that lived for a couple of years, and that's where we were doing a lot of training. In my opinion, having trained both states and big cities and little cities on how to do this, I think that the Assessment of Fair Housing tool worked really well for a moderate size or larger size urban community. It's a little tricky to apply regionally. It was a little tough for smaller communities, particularly that maybe didn't have leadership support or understanding of why they needed to do this, or couldn't really enact effective action items. So there was a bit more work that needed to get done. That after 2016, that obligation wasn't actively enforced. And then in 2020, HUD proposed a new rule that had a little bit of what I'll call a risk assessment factor to it. So it was really kind of a self-evaluation with some metrics that would trigger more of a fair housing examination. But those metrics were kind of complicated, and it didn't, seem to me that those metrics were going to really return the outcomes that were needed. So, for example, a community that is typically racially and ethnically segregated, they can be doing a lot of good things to eliminate that, but that segregation could have been determined by a lot of the bad stuff that happened and the inequities and to housing choice that happened 50 years ago. The most diverse communities in America tend to be urban areas, and the least diverse are oftentimes communities that have engaged in exclusionary behavior and kept people out. So that risk assessment didn't really get to the heart of the problem. It didn't last very long, because in July 2020, the Assessment of Fair Housing or the concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing started to become politicized. I could invite, you could Google that and find all the kind of back and forth that happened then. But suddenly AFFH is in the news, and HUD eliminated the reporting requirement and just basically said in that rule, AFFH is really hard to define. We're going to kind of think about what this really means. For now, municipalities who are on this in this meeting, or IHFA and Commerce, you all figure it out. You self-define and you can self-certify. Go ahead and go forward, Eric. And so that, in our opinion, for our clients, it caused a lot of confusion, but it also put, I would argue, particularly if you are in a community that has a lot of activism around fair housing, it puts you in a really, really vulnerable place. So no longer did you have the Fair Housing Planning Guide that you could look to for guidance in how to do these studies and certify you were affirmatively furthering fair housing. No longer did you have the assessment of fair housing that was really, really prescriptive. It told you what maps to use, what data to analyze, what tables to pull in, and as burdensome as some felt the assessment of fair housing was, HUD had to approve it. So for me, if I am a locality and I'm vulnerable to potentially lawsuits around not properly affirmatively furthering fair housing, if I can turn and say, but HUD said that I did it right because they approved my AFH, I'm in a much better place than if I am self-certifying and trying to defend that. So, with all the drama that was happening around what it means to affirmatively furthering fair housing, I would argue at that time the federal government did a real disservice to the communities it was trying to protect through that self-certification. It made them very vulnerable. So the good news is, I think, that right now there's a middle ground for this stuff. And so what the Biden administration did in 2021 is restored certain affirmatively furthering fair housing definitions and certifications, but then kept the door open, not necessarily for self-certification, but options for compliance. So if you need to certify, because you're doing a consolidated plan and your HUD representative is asking you for certification, or you're getting money from IHFA and Commerce and they're asking you to demonstrate how to affirmatively further fair housing, we'll talk about that in a moment. You've got some options. As an entitlement community, you can do an AI, you could take an assessment of fair housing approach, you could do a hybrid. One option, which a colleague of mine here in Colorado who runs a housing authority, he and I have kicked around, is what if you were allowed to take a really deep dive into an issue that is hard to solve, such as education inequity, and that would be your big thing to certify that you're affirmatively furthering fair housing. So basically you have options now, and I think if there's any Federal Register rule that you read, this one is it, particularly if you're a housing planner or a planner. This rule does a really good job of stepping through all of the case law that leads up to this question about what does affirmatively furthering fair housing mean, and I think it's easy to read and it does a really nice job. So long story short, what that rule says is the cancellation in a year ago in July 2020 of the basically the obligation to, or that allowed that self-certification, was too narrow, was inconsistent with the case law, and didn't really reflect the spirit of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And I would agree with that rule. I think this decision puts communities in a little bit of a better place. Although I would argue, if I were a community, that I'd still prefer the HUD stamp of approval, because that just tells me that I'm doing this the right way. Go ahead and go forward. So now I'm going to shift entirely to what we've been working on with the state, and this is an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice and what we've learned so far. And I think that maybe some of this information may resonate with all of you. So my firm is under contract with Commerce and with IHFA to update their analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. You may have participated in some focus groups with our staff or a stakeholder survey that we ran. And I just want to give you a little bit of a preview of what we're finding. Um, Interestingly, Eric talked about the link between economic growth and housing, and I talked a little bit about housing stability and the long-term returns on that. We didn't preface or go into this study thinking that was going to be what we were really going to focus on, but in the West right now, with all of the housing pressures that we have, I think people are starting to make or see those direct links. So as a business, it's hard for me to hire people because they can't find housing. I can't keep employees fully employed because they can't get childcare. And so COVID really exposed, COVID plus the desire for people to relocate since they can work remotely into Western states really exposed these vulnerabilities. And it's loud and clear in the study so far, that link between housing stability and economic growth. So most people are telling us, absolutely, our economic development's compromised by housing shortages. We're really, really worried about education. We're losing teachers, we're losing principals. We cannot staff our schools, particularly in rural areas. Lack of childcare also came up as a barrier to business growth, predominantly in rural Idaho. And then in terms of public transportation, where we see that most pronounced was for people with disabilities, but also for workers in the agriculture and service industries, that the lack of transportation options, people don't get paid enough to have a car, or households have split commutes, but they can only afford one car, and the non-driver doesn't really have options to be able to get to work, and that's affecting employment. Go ahead and go forward. So I actually put in some of the quotes from our stakeholders who participated in the survey, those that I felt like really represented some of the challenges. We heard a lot about barriers for people with disabilities. This is typically the place where the most complaints are in fair housing, both in Idaho as well as nationally. And those take the form of, I can't find housing, I can't find affordable housing that's accessible, I can't get around. So there may be, if I'm somebody who's blind, there may be a curb cut in one part of a community, but it's on the other side of the street, there's not an equal curb cut. I can't figure out how to cross the street. It's just not, the community is not planned for me to be able to get around easily. So when we engage in planning, you typically think about it from the perspective of somebody who is not blind, and a lot of us are thinking about how can cars get around first and foremost, not people. And so stepping back and thinking about planning through the lens of people who may or may not be like you, or may not be like 98% of your community, I think really needs to happen. Some people said, Coeur d'Alene and Moscow are doing a really good job of thinking about this. They're making strides toward accessibility. It would be great if everybody else could maybe, think a little more progressively around planning for people with a variety of disabilities. Go ahead and go forward, Eric. And then the other thing that came, out loud and clear, and we looked back to the study we'd done 5 years ago to see how things differed. And I would definitely say people are saying that we didn't have any housing shortages. We didn't really even think about it. And oh my goodness, now we have these huge challenges. We don't know how to think about this, talk about this. We certainly don't have capacity to react. Even if we get dollars, there's nowhere to put anybody. So there's inadequate supply. We're stuck and we don't know what to do. So just some, quotes that I think really capture the spirit of this. Lots of folks have been renting in the same place. Now they're priced out. They're now in shelters. People have been homeless. People or they're close to falling into homelessness, and they were always housed. Like suddenly they can't afford their housing. The other thing that, in thinking about vouchers or tenant-based rental assistance or emergency rental assistance, landlords in these kinds of markets can be very, very choosy. And so, and there's creative ways that they can discriminate against people. And sometimes they don't engage in very creative ways and they just do it very directly. But if I'm a low income person, I am competing against all the people who are moving into a community who have more money than I do. And it's very easy right now in a market like ours to take the person without the voucher who you may trust, who may not have as much of a stigma in your mind. And that's just putting a real constraint on housing people who have the worst case needs. Go ahead and go forward. But the other thing I really want to emphasize is that we do an analysis called disproportionate housing needs. So we look at housing needs overall, and then we take a deeper dive and ask the question of, does this affect certain people more than others? And that's something that I would challenge you all to do when you do housing needs assessments, because that helps you understand how to prioritize your resources. So what we've found thus far is that farm workers and larger families are living in substandard housing conditions, oftentimes because they can't find anywhere else to live. It's reported that Native Americans face housing discrimination when trying to find homes to rent off of reservations. Refugees have a lot of trouble with language barriers that can result in housing discriminations. And then landlords in highly religious communities won't rent to single mothers or LGBTQ residents. And then in terms of this 4 times the rent, which this is the first time I've seen 4 times the rent. So in high cost markets, it's a common practice of landlords to say, I won't rent to you unless your income is, typically we see 3 times the rent. This is honestly the first time I've seen 4 times the rent. And I only include certain types of income in this calculation. So I only include earned income. I won't count child support because you might not get it. I don't want to count SSDI. That's not income. I'm not going to count alimony. Sometimes you see funky calculations around the voucher. So this is something to really pay attention to because it can have a disproportionate impact on people who are on fixed incomes. So people with disabilities, as well as single parents who do rely on child support to be able to make ends meet. We've also been told that group home closures have made it very, very difficult for people with disabilities to find housing. It was the only place they could live, and now they can't find anywhere to live, and they're falling into homelessness. And then again, just sort of this general stigma associated with that landlords have in their mind associated with people who have any kind of voucher assistance. With that, I'm going to just turn it over to Elizabeth, who's going to talk a little more specifically about the work she's doing in your entitlement communities.
Great. My name's Elizabeth McNanny, and I am the owner and managing member of Resource Consultants. We are an organization that provides planning services to HUD entitlement jurisdictions for both 5-year plans, annual action plans, as well as analysis of impediments work and other fair housing work in jurisdictions. We also are working with communities around ARPA funding that they're receiving, not home art, but the state, local fiscal recovery funds primarily. And we also are a technical assistance provider for multiple communities around the country related to HUD and ARPA funding. And I apologize for the light behind me, but I am sitting in my home today in Oregon, where I woke up and it was 31 degrees and it's a little bit chilly here. So we are based in Oregon. We do work nationwide with entitlement communities around, filling their distinct needs. And Idaho specifically, we work with a number of folks in Idaho. Currently, we are working with for actively working with 4 jurisdictions that are entitlement cities. And 3 of those we are either knee deep or neck deep into the AI process, or just starting that process in some cases. So some of the challenges to affirmatively furthering fair housing in some of these smaller entitlement communities, and all of Idaho's entitlement communities would be considered small or small mid-sized communities, with only one, Boise, receiving over $1 million from HUD in a year. So across all programs, direct entitlement. And some of the challenges are internal capacity, because you may have one staff person or half of a staff person, or no one actually fully staffing your CDBG program. So that can be a capacity issue. And we've seen this across the country. This is not, this is not Idaho specific. So this is pretty much across the country a challenge. And if you couple that with all of these extra funds, the COVID funding, the CDBG CV funding, both tranche 1 and tranche 3 that entitlement communities received, and the need to get that out the door, it has created some really significant challenges within those communities. Limited resources. So it is true that a lot of smaller communities don't have an affordable housing fund that's funded through general funds or some other mechanism within their jurisdiction. So it really is about limited resources. So what you can do with your resources if you only receive, $300,000 to $700,000 a year is limited. So it truly is about partnerships and leveraging and opportunities that you may have to dig a little deeper for. And then there's a lack of guidance provided by funders. And by funders, I mean HUD. So while the Fair Housing Planning Guide is absolutely, I will parrot what Heidi said, that the Fair Housing Planning Guide is a wonderful resource. If you are looking for technical assistance through that process, it is not always easy to know who to call, how to get it, and how to ask for what you need. And in a lot of cases, and I'll take the Treasure Valley as an example, HUD asked us very specifically what kind of TA we wanted. We told them, and then they gave us something else. So, sometimes it's about, really knowing where to look and, how to find that information. So, when I say, what do we need to know? It's way more than we can cover in this one session today. And I think, we are all happy to be resources moving forward. But we'll start with the next slide. So I won't dig too deep into this. I'll go through this because I know that Heidi touched on this, that grantees certify annually that we will undertake activities that affirmatively further fair housing. And that is the issue that got Westchester in a bit of a muddled state, or in a lot of trouble, actually, because they were certifying that they affirmatively furthered fair housing without actually taking actions that would do that. So it's really about, how do we look at what we are doing in our jurisdictions and think about that housing wise through a fair housing lens. And it does extend to all housing and housing related activities in the grantee's jurisdictional area, whether it's publicly or privately funded. If you take that HUD dollar, $1, it extends to all of the housing and housing related activities that you undertake. So this is, this is an issue that can come back to bite jurisdictions and has, and that is where some of the lawsuits that have been talked about have stemmed from, the fact that it encompasses all of the projects that you undertake. Next slide. So there are a couple of ways to think about impediments. They can be direct violations and direct impediments. So it could have to do with something that's easy to understand, like the work transit connection or a fair housing violation, or rent costs and availability, or it could be counterproductive. So a violation can be NIMBYism. And, it's good to think about what that means for planners. Next slide. And an example of what NIMBYism looks like, and I'll have a couple of them, but one is unequal treatment of conditional use permits or variance requests or rezoning requests in a jurisdiction for market rate as opposed to accessible and or affordable housing development. So when you're looking at this, if you have 10, and I'll take round numbers, if you have 10 market rate developments that come to you asking for rezoning for higher density or whatever they're asking for, and you approve 8 of those, and you have 10 affordable housing developments come to the planning department and ask for the same thing, and you approve 0 to 2 of those, then you may be kind of verging on the counterproductive to direct violation. You may be moving into the next category, but it is counterproductive. The other thing that can happen in communities, and we've worked with one where this is a reality, they have outright allowable multifamily development in a number of their commercial zones. And because they're worried about commercial property, they're looking at changing that ordinance to make that a rezoning request or a variance. So that would actually be putting an impediment in place where there hadn't been one before. And it would likely fall under counterproductive. So these are things that planners can kind of think about as you're looking at changing zoning ordinance or, looking at variance requests. How would that look through the fair housing lens? And this one with the unequal treatment is probably the most prevalent negative action that we see across the country that's not like a very direct fair housing violation that does kind of live in the planning department realm. Next slide. So some impediments that we have identified, we are currently working with to update Caldwell and their analysis of impediments. We are contracted with the City of Meridian to undertake an update to an analysis of impediments, as well as looking at some health housing intersection components in the City of Meridian. And we are also working with the City of Pocatello. So these are just some examples of things that we have come up with. And, in some of our preliminary work, none of these studies are complete, and some of them are just at the very beginning stages. We're seeing a lot of communities who lack a compliant language access plan. And that goes into the second part of that sentence, that document translation may be hit or miss. But a compliant language access plan is required not just for folks who receive HUD funding, but across a lot of federal programs. Many federal dollars trigger the requirement for a language access plan that directly relates to those dollars received. And HUD is no exception. So, you know, having a compliant language access plan is a good start. We also see a lot of communities who may be doing some great things as far as fair housing outreach and activities go, but they are not recording that appropriately. And, you know, having a folder with your fair housing activities is really important. Outreach is perfunctory sometimes and may not meet the obligation as required under planning. And job transit connections are definitely a challenge. We also have heard, we have been looking at facilitating stakeholder groups kind of across some of these communities that we're working in. And one thing that's come up over and over and over again is that bottom bullet point, the job transit connection. Transportation is very limited, and opportunities across the state. You know, if you have someone who is one vehicle repair away from losing their job and then losing their housing, this becomes a huge issue. And this is over and over again. We had a developer who develops both market rate and affordable housing at one of our stakeholder meetings say the rent increases that they were seeing in the market rate units was alarming, that it was pricing even moderate income folks out of the rental market. And just the supply of affordable housing and shortages in the housing market. And NIMBYism, of course, comes up at every single one of our stakeholder sessions when we think about, you know, if we're always pushing the affordable housing to the next city over, or saying someone else will take care of this or someone else will solve our problem, we have to realize that the folks around us are doing the same thing looking at us. So this is really an opportunity to think maybe a little bit outside the box. And I know in Idaho, there are definitely some challenges with the way that you can request that developers include affordable housing in their developments. And I'm not suggesting that if a developer comes to you as a planner with an outright eligible multifamily project that, you know, you try to include or try to force them to include some affordable housing in that market rate project. But I would suggest that if rezoning or other variance is requested, that that's the time to negotiate with developers. They want something from you, and it's been a one-way street almost always for a long, long time. They want something from you. It's okay to want something back at that point. So that's when the negotiation can happen. And, you know, you can negotiate density bonuses based on a certain amount of affordable housing being included. There are lots of other ways to look at options for affordable housing in our communities that we haven't really thought about. And it's important to remember that kind of across a lot of these smaller entitlement communities and more rural communities is that the renters, the low and moderate income renters, are housing cost burdened at a rate that the homeowners, even very low income and low income homeowners, are not typically. So the homeowners are at lower risk of losing their homes. Not that it doesn't happen, but they're at lower risk than the renters are in the same income bracket. So I would just challenge everyone to kind of think a little bit outside of the normal way that we have done business in the past, and it's important to really look at the way that we can change our communities. And in closing, I will say that one of the communities that we work with, Caldwell, has the only recap in Idaho, I believe, a racial and or ethnically concentrated area of poverty. And in the last 5 years, we have made a very, very intentional decision to invest a lot of money and are leveraging dollars both into housing and public facility improvements like parks and things like that in that area. So there is a way that we can make a difference that's long-term and impactful in our communities. And sometimes it's just, taking a different look at the way that we've always done things. Thank you.
I'll jump right into it. Good morning, everybody. My name is Tony Tenney. I work with the state CDBG program. So we're a recipient of about $8 million a year of HUD money, and then we deal with very small communities. So the Nampas, the Caldwells, they get their own money. Pocatello, Twin Falls recently became an entitlement community. We're the balance of states. So we're the real small incorporated and unincorporated towns throughout the state. And what do? We have several different categories that these cities and counties can apply for. We have public facilities, so we do a lot of water, sewer projects, streets, fire stations, things like that. Under our economic development set aside, we can do downtown revitalization, which would include, ADA improvements within downtowns, addressing substandard infrastructure systems throughout the cities. And then we can also provide grants to businesses, be city-owned infrastructure, city or county-owned infrastructure, to aid businesses in job creation. And then we also do senior citizen and community centers throughout the state. We do rehab, we can do new ones. And then also we do parks. That's a new set aside for us. So we can do pools. Seems like that's a popular one that there's not a lot of funding for, pool rehab. That's a public safety, obviously, concern with people learning how to swim, and post-disaster grants as well. So we've had some seismic activity throughout the state, damages water and sewer systems, things like that. We use our grant set asides for that as well. So what we do, how this relates to the analysis of impediments and how we affirmatively further fair housing is, you go to the next slide. Oh, here, that's good. What we require of grantees. So we work with these small grantees. They're awarded a CDBG grant for their sewer project. And then within their award letter, they're required to adopt and publish a fair, or at least adopt a fair housing resolution. So it seems like it catches a lot of communities off guard. What we do is we take the research of say root policy from the AI, we incorporate it into our conditions for our grantees or small grantees throughout the state. So what is it we have them do? To affirmatively further fair housing, we will have a city designate a fair housing resource person. So what we've seen, these small communities, there's turnover. They haven't received a CDBG grant in a long time, and they have new staff, they have new city council. So upfront, we have them designate a fair housing resource person. We have them adopt if they apply, and publish if they're awarded a CDBG grant, the fair housing resolution itself. And then ongoing, if it's a multi-year project, we require them to have a proclamation as April as Fair Housing Month. We have posters that we receive from Eric and IHFA, and we distribute them to the grantees. We require them to post them, like you'd see EEO requirements, grievance procedures, things like that. Things you'd see on a board in any given city. And then we have them do the The big one, and what I'm going to review now, is we'll have them conduct a fair housing assessment. And what we do is we take the findings. This was from our last analysis of impediments. Stakeholders are engaged, they give feedback. We have Heidi and her firm conduct our AI. And then we take from that, we include it in our fair housing assessment forward that we require the cities to do. So I'll go over a little bit of what we require from that fair housing assessment. So the first thing, again, is designate a fair housing resource person. So somebody is usually the city clerk, somebody like that, kind of front line, and they wear a lot of hats, and a lot of times this is new to them. So it's something that an additional task they're taking on. We have them look at their comprehensive plan. So these were direct findings from our last AI, and this is what we have them look at, as the city. So when was the last plan updated? Was the plan updated in the last 10 years? Is there a housing component covered in it? Analysis of housing conditions and needs, things like that. The next thing we look at, we'll have them take a look at their zoning. This has come a lot in the past couple of days, but does the city city or county zoning allow for the development of row houses or townhomes, single family zones, things like that to address fair housing issues and increased density, and at least look at it. A lot of this is an education piece for these communities to take a look at these things. We'll look at zoning for group homes, and then within our AI or fair housing assessment, we cite some of the legal cases that have been reviewed here, and I think I heard a couple of those yesterday as well. The Alomar Ranch versus Boise County case, and then there's one against the city of Payette. So we have them look at the different kind of legal issues that can come up if they don't address these. We have them look at EDUs. Does zoning allow for accessory dwelling units? And then the zoning should allow accessory dwelling units in at least one zone district, either as an additional unit within an existing structure or a separate building within the same lot. Is there a single family home provision within zoning? A 1-0 step entrance, doors within 32 inches of clear passage space, a bathroom on the main floor, things like that to make it more accessible. And if no, then would the city, with a lot of these, consider doing this in the future? And again, with zoning, we'll look at density bonus. Has the city considered creating a density bonus for affordable housing in single unit zones, etc. And then again, as like Elizabeth said, on the entitlement level and the small communities, we'll have them look at a language, an LEP analysis. It's a 4-factor analysis, deciding whether or not there's enough non-native English speakers within the jurisdiction to require a language access plan. And then within transportation, again, this is one that came up and Heidi mentioned earlier as well. Are there transportation options for individuals within the community? If not, are there future plans for this? We had a potential grant come up. We're talking about it's a city close to Sun Valley. They need some surface parking within it to transport the workers to and from the Sun Valley area. So do they have that? Or there's up north, there's different areas that feed into the Quarry Lane and some of the bigger cities. So transportation is a big issue for this. And then does the city and county have representation on public transportation associations or public transportation advisory council? So do they have people taking a look at this? And then along those same lines, do you have a transportation plan? We'll also have them look at their property tax policies. Does the county have in place procedures and personnel to advise the public of property tax reductions? And then looking at things like residential property tax exemptions or circuit breaker exemptions for individuals who meet certain income or other requirements. The fifth thing we'll look at is the fair housing education and outreach. So has the city or county adopted and published a fair housing resolution, which is something we require. So we usually say yes, or they will in the future. And are they, performing those activities outlined within the resolution itself? And then we have, we have posters to put up in English and Spanish. The sixth thing we look at is economic development. So does the city or county belong to an economic development organization? So we have regional ones. I work up north a lot. So there's Panhandle Area Council, there's Clearwater Economic Development Association. There's ones throughout the state. And these communities can engage with them to help with these things, these fair housing assessments and requirements that come with the HUD grants, and also job creation and development of the small jurisdictions. So the seventh thing we'll look at real estate brokerage. Is there a brokerage association of realtors who represent the city, and do they offer fair market housing training opportunities for its members? And do they monitor and review real estate publications to ensure non-discriminatory advertising practices? So they want to make sure that real estate sales are all above board as well. The city needs to engage them to make sure of this. And finally, what we'll do with the assessment is we'll have a list of action items. If community answered no to any of those questions I kind of went over, they'll outline that impediment, and then they'll have future actions on how they can assess those impediments. And then when they're a grantee with us again, if it's sometime soon, we'll take a look at that again. Be like, well, these were your impediments, your last CDBG grant you had with us. What have you done to address those? So we will, maybe moving forward, look at the new AI coming out when Heidi and their group, in collaboration with IHFA and us, when they roll that out, and we'll be tweaking this fair housing assessment moving forward to kind of incorporate the new tasks at hand and doing our part to get this out into the small rural areas. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Eric.
Okay, thanks everybody. Great information. These are some links that will be available for you at the end of the presentation. We'll hand that off to APA so they can upload it to their site for your use. So I just want to check in with Jesse and see if we've got any questions in the queue at this point.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions, and if you have any other ones out there, just go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and I can go ahead and read them out loud, and we can get some answers for you. So first, we have a question that says, we are considering being a sponsor for some community block grants for small communities in our county so they can repair their water systems. We have a lot of concerns about our liability under the AFFH. We are not an entitlement community, and what is your advice?
And I think we have less about 15 minutes left. So let's see if we can get some good quick responses to these.
We recently had a county that was going to sponsor. So like say a county can sponsor a grant for unincorporated areas or like water and sewer districts. And they didn't want to deal with affirmatively furthering fair housing at this time. So they're reviewing it. They're having their legal counsel review it. But we just say this is what we require. And then what we spoke about earlier with Heidi, these are old. These are old laws, and you can't violate the Fair Housing Act. And then this is what we require as part of being a grantee for CDBG.
And Tony, if I could piggyback on that, It is my personal opinion that the way that commerce, in particular, is tackling this, with the way that their requirements. I think that they're very thoughtful and like the right way to do this, because it does definitely helps communities like yours reduce vulnerability to challenges if you were to receive that money. And it's very tailored to. So, in thinking about, Tony talked a little bit about some of the zoning and land use pieces. We, in the AI we did 5 years ago, and the subsequent AI, reviewed county level zoning requirement or zoning ordinances for any kind of like worry fair, kind of Fair Housing Act potential challenges. And we have a lawyer planner who works with us on that, who's very good and I would say is very reasonable. So I don't think that there's a lot of like overreach in this case. I think it's a pretty balanced approach to kind of taking what you're required to do under the federal government law, but like Tony said, it's been around for a long time, and just tailoring that for Idaho communities.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have one more right now. This one's for Elizabeth. Our city leadership wants to ensure that new growth doesn't cost the city to serve, meaning values need to be high enough for taxes to cover police, fire, etc. Council often asks, what are the average rents going to be? Is city council potentially stepping into discrimination under the desire for development to pay for itself?
So I will answer that by it depends. And yeah, again, if you are just, really systemically refusing to look at affordable housing development as opposed to market rate housing development and rezoning requests for one or the other, the answer would be maybe and or possibly or likely. But, it's really about thinking about this holistically, because it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both together. So there needs to be a balance of market rate and affordable units. And when we talk about affordable units, we're in moderate income for the Treasure Valley area is really, we're talking about your police officers who have recently been hired, and your teachers, and many of your city employees, as well as the grocery store clerk and the waitress or waiter who serves you, your service professionals. So we're not just talking about the folks that we have traditionally looked at as low income. We're talking about people who are truly vital to our community. And not that I want to discount the need for more low and very low income housing, but it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be a range that serves the entire community holistically.
And I like to, kind of remind a lot of audiences when we're talking about, low income housing tax credit or home program, funding, the folks served typically are people that work for a living up to $20 an hour full time. So that counts for a lot of people in the state. And in fact, I think the latest stat I saw was 70% of the jobs in Idaho pay $20 an hour or less. And I think it might be 65 or 66% of the jobs pay $15 an hour or less. So we're talking about housing for the majority of the people who work for a living in the state are going to be the folks that live in these properties. So it's definitely, it impacts every community. And I'll be part of the Partners for Rural America conference next week. We're going to be talking about housing on a housing plenary for that. And, that involves healthcare. I mean, Elizabeth mentioned, teachers, but where are your nurses going to live? Where are your med techs going to live? The big question I have that kind of relates tangentially to fair housing is, people with disabilities, the seniors and even kids, we rely a lot on caregivers, in-home caregivers and healthcare providers. Where will they live? Because we all depend on them if we have someone in our family that needs that caregiver, that means we get to go to work and show up for work every day. But if we don't have that caregiver as a reliable, resource, that's going to impact our productivity.
I'll also add just
Sorry, go ahead.
briefly that it is really important to look at how health is affected by housing instability. So it's far more effective or far more expensive for communities to deal with the health crises that happen related to housing instability than it is to look at how we make housing more stable in our communities across the state. And these projects pay taxes. They pay taxes, they pay property taxes. So, I think there's a misunderstanding about that often, that these projects don't pay their fair share, and they not pay their fair in comparison to into the market.
Yeah, and I like to remind folks that, sometimes affordability is a trigger word for some folks in your community. And so I just like to focus on making sure that you have a mix of housing types and price points that meet the needs and incomes of everyone in your community. That's the bottom line. And when you have that, that's a healthy housing market and a healthy community. Any other questions?
Yeah, we got a couple more. First, could you speak to the difference between an entitlement and non-entitlement community? Is there a full list of cities in Idaho who have done fair housing assessments?
Heidi or Elizabeth, you want to take that?
I'll just talk. Oh, just I'll tell you who the entitlement communities are in Idaho, and then Heidi, if you want to jump in. So in the Treasure Valley, you've got 4 in a line. You have Boise, Meridian, Nampa, and Caldwell. Caldwell being the newest of those 4 entitlements, just ending their 5th year as an entitlement community and starting their second 5-year con plan. Coeur d'Alene, Lewiston, Twin Falls, Idaho Falls, and Pocatello are the other entitlements in the state. Twin Falls, I believe, being the newest entitlement community in the state of Idaho. So they have all done at least an analysis of impediments. And Heidi, I'll let you address more information.
Sure, yeah. Excuse me. The basic criteria, you become an entitlement community typically because you're getting the Community Development Block Grant, and that's it depends on if you are it's typically a population trigger, so 50,000 and more. But there's also like Lewiston. I don't know, Elizabeth, if they reached the 50,000 mark. I don't think so. But you can be like the most major city in like a micropolitan area too, is kind of the basic qualifying criteria. But you also have to want to receive those funds. So you have to apply for that status. You can be over that population limit, but not be an entitlement community if you haven't taken steps to become one. And in that case, you would be eligible to get funds from the state. So as an entitlement, you get money from HUD directly versus going through a competitive process from the state.
And there is information about how HUD utilizes that formula. There's actually a YouTube video. It's riveting. It's not, but if you are interested in how HUD makes that calculation, it's not entitlement in the way that we think of entitlement sometimes. It just means that you get a direct allocation because you've reached a certain population level. But if you have more questions about how HUD does that calculation, there is information out there, including that riveting YouTube video.
And I want to add something to the question we had about, housing paying for itself. When we talk about affordability, that just means that it's not costing you more than 30% of your household income. If you're paying more than that, you're housing cost burdened. And what that means is you have less money left over at the end of each month to invest or purchase taxable goods and services in your community. So you're not able to contribute as much, of your income towards your local economy. And there's been some studies by the Shift Research Lab out of Denver, where they estimate that Idaho lost $670 billion in 2018 alone. No, $670 million in 2018 due to foregone spending linked to housing cost burden. So when you think about, does it pay for itself? If people are housing cost burdened, they're going to rely on public assistance. They're going to show up at your ER for primary care. They're going to be less productive. Their kids are going to be less, sort of reliable in school, and they're going to have a lot of negative outcomes that are going to be passed on to taxpayers. And not only that, but you're missing out on their income, basically circulating through your economy. So $670 million in 2018 seems like it's pretty insignificant compared to what it might be now, given the rapid inflation in housing costs. So I think it's worth thinking holistically about, that equation of, affordable versus inflated housing prices paying for itself.
Yeah. We have two more questions. I think we can squeeze them in here. Could you clarify what you mean when you said that if you take every $1 of HUD money, that everything is subject to fair housing? What does everything mean? And do all new housing builds have to comply with certain requirements, or does that mean something else?
Yeah, it means that if you accept HUD funding, that you have to certify and then take those actions that are required to overcome housing choice challenges. So if you accept $1 in HUD funding, you have to certify that you will affirmatively further fair housing in your community. That's basically all it means.
Okay, and then the last question we have here, if 70% of Idaho workers earn $20 per hour or less, how can working people even qualify for a mortgage, assuming that they have the down payment?
That's a great question. A lot of them can't right now. And one of the other factors, I think, in kind of that contributes to that current reality is that a lot of the homes on the market right now are being bought by folks for cash over asking price in a lot of communities. And that really prices out folks who work for a living locally in those communities. So first-time buyers trying to get a starter home, they're going to be outbid, 19 times out of 20 or 99 times out of 100. The realtors I talk to say that that's a real common experience for them. Trying to work with clients that are trying to buy their first home, they just tell them right off the bat, just be prepared to not get the first 20 or 40 homes that you look at. So that's an issue. And I think it's worth kind of always remembering that you can make housing affordable one of two ways. You can either raise wages and in perpetuity to try and keep up with housing inflation, or you can create indexed in some way to the prevailing wages in your community or in your state. I don't know of any other third way. If there is one, I'm all ears.
And I think that is where you get the multi-pronged approach in a lot of entitlement communities, where you are supporting the development of multifamily housing and LIHTC projects and things like that, and also supporting with potentially acquisition dollars for land and assistance for the home buyers to get into those homes. It can be a multi-pronged approach. And in Caldwell, in the first 5 years, and I'll just take that as an example because I'm very familiar with what's happened in that community. In the first 5 years, we leveraged a very small amount of CDBG dollars, because they get less than $500,000 a year, to build 100 affordable housing units, multifamily housing units that included also transitional housing and permanent supportive housing units within those developments, as well as supporting the development and home buyers in 10 home ownership model homes, and most of those in the recap area. So there are ways to take a multi-pronged approach. We have 6 more of those coming online and 30 more units, multifamily units coming online within the next 6 to 12 months too.
Great. Thank you so much for all this information. I think that is our time for today. If anybody else has any last minute things they'd want to wrap up.
Well, I'd just like to thank the A team here for their presentations. You guys did a great job. I really appreciate your help on this.
Thank you, Eric, for coordinating.
Okay. Well, enjoy the rest of the conference. And if you get a chance to check out the PRA conference, I'll put a link in the Whova chat box for that one. That's next week. And it's really inexpensive. It's only $15 for 2 days. All about rural, everything you want to know about rural.
All right, great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. This has been a great presentation. We learned a lot.
Okay, everybody take care.
Bye.